Tim, so I want to jump right into this because I know we always end up talking actual football with you, and we end up forgetting about some of the recruiting stuff. So I want to start with the recruiting stuff so we actually get to it. I know there's a big weekend for Nebraska trying to flip a 4-star. Tell us a little bit about who's going to be in town this weekend.
Yeah, so the headliner obviously is Chase Lofton. Nebraska's working there, trying to pull off that flip. I think that one's an interesting one, just because we've talked about this when he made the decision over the summer and in the week since. It felt like Nebraska actually finished not even runner up, but third in that recruitment initially, and to maintain the presence that they did since, and to be able to, get him back on campus. The only visit he has planned, and, feels like things are trending well for Nebraska here. I know some people look at this and are like, hey, this is another tight end addition to a room that's pretty loaded. If you go back and watch his film from his senior year and even his junior year, and some of the things he does, he just fits. And you listen to what Matt Rule says about wanting to be a positionless offense. He just fits that. He's what they're looking for. He's a big vertical threat, or a big, a big pass catcher that can stretch defenses vertically. You watch him run routes, how big he is, and how fluid he moves at that size. It's impressive. I'm a big fan of Chase, from what I've seen his senior year. I know there's been something that's been made of like, hey, he hasn't really shown like this insistence to stay home. Well, here it is. He's coming on campus, and I think Nebraska's going to have a chance to pull that one off. That's the headliner. And, in 2026, they're getting ahead with a couple defenders. A guy I'd keep a close eye on, Nolan Wilson. He's a 4-star defensive end who over the last month or so has landed offers from Alabama and Florida and all these SEC programs. Nebraska's in that mix. He's from the same high school as Dante Dowdell. He's coming in with Dante's father and Dante's family. That's a good opportunity for Nebraska to get involved there. Looking ahead to 27, they've got 3 top 50 prospects in the Rivals top 100. So they're getting out way ahead in the 2027 class with the number 1 receiver in the country, a top 5 running back, and another top pass catcher in the class. So it's going to be a good weekend. I think Nebraska's going to have an opportunity to potentially land a commit or two to the 2026 class, and really get ahead with 2027 in just terms of getting these guys on campus.
TV. Oh, go ahead, Ravi.
Oh, I just wanted to ask you real quick about Loftin, because we have talked about him quite a bit with you, and that's a guy that I'm curious if you've had a chance to figure out both because I don't think either of us, I think we talked, I don't think either of us actually expected him to sign at Florida State, and I don't totally know why. We just kind of got this vibe, I think, or at least I did. I don't want to speak for you. And I was like, yeah, I don't think he's going to end up there, even when he committed. So do you know what happened there? Is it just the 1-7 start and everything at Florida State? And you mentioned Nebraska not even really being the runner-up there. How were they able to make up that ground?
Yeah, I think it's just consistency, and it comes back to that with the staff of just like, hey, even when he committed, even when, there were times where, the love wasn't necessarily being shown back, Nebraska stayed consistent. And I think, like Marcus Satterfield played a role. I know a lot of people around here don't want to really give him a whole lot of credit for things anymore, but, he played a role in that one. And to his credit as well, Keith Williams is kind of taking over in the tight ends rooms, done some work there too. So those two specifically, again, like with Florida State, it's part of it's the 1-7 start. Part of it is just like, I think, like we talked about, I think when he initially committed it never felt like he was going to end up there for a variety of reasons. You kind of see where college football is trending with the SEC and the Big Ten. You kind of see, like for him, the family relationships in the Midwest. If there was any place other than Nebraska, it felt like it was going to be A&M, which was a school I think Nebraska had to overcome some ground on. And that just happened, I think, with the proximity to home, and again the consistency of the staff relative to an A&M staff that is as aggressive as they are on the transfer on recruiting. So they had moved on to other targets, and they've kept multiple fires or coals in the fire. Nebraska was kind of just all in on Loftin as like the sole remaining tight end on the board, and I think that's part of the reason why they're getting this visit from him and now are positioned where they are to potentially flip him.
Yeah, as good as you are every week, I have no reason to doubt your recon, but I'm going to validate something you said. I think the fact that Nebraska kept the lines of communication open even after I think Lofton says yes, Nebraska's got the type of staff TV that's going to say, okay, hey, we wish you the best. Go do your thing. But in kind of like this exit interview, what was it that kept you from picking us? So I think they kind of gather data, they get an answer, they talk to the family, and I think they try to accentuate their strengths more than play to the weaknesses. And I think the fact that they did keep those lines of communication open really helped this thing get to where it's at. I think you're spot on in terms of how it evolved. Spot on.
I appreciate it. Yeah, and yeah, and I think part of it, what also helps, in my opinion, the camaraderie of the 2025 in-state group. Like those guys really get along, and they've done their part as well, to peer recruit and make guys, in the state that want to come to Nebraska feel like they are wanted.
Tim,
I don't care.
DB's just throwing stuff out here. Tim, let's move on to actual football on the field here. But let's start with Ohio State. How did you feel about the way Nebraska responded to that Indiana game? Obviously, we talked a lot about not taking moral victories and stuff like that in that Ohio State game. But, you could probably count on one hand the number of people in this entire state that thought that Ohio State game was going to go as well as it did. Like, how do you measure progress versus not taking moral victories there?
I mean, I think you have to measure progress. And I think, something I saw coming out of that game was, oh, great, another moral victory game. And it's like, okay, listen, I get that this fan base is frustrated about the, like, moral victory is such like a trigger word, a trigger phrase. But you have, like, that was the last staff. The last staff was the one that was, like, hanging their hats on moral victories. This staff hasn't really done that. But when they get these opportunities to actually have moral victories, you got to give them the credit, And there's a reason they feel like, when Rob Dvorak on the radio on Wednesday night, they left that locker room disappointed because they felt they should have won that game. That's the biggest thing. It's not that Nebraska went into that game and was like, oh, we came up close, good for us. It was that they were disappointed and fired up by the fact that they felt that they should have come out with that win. And so I think you're going to see a fired up Nebraska, specifically on the defensive side of the ball, the rest of the year, because they know what they're capable of now. And again, like, I think we're going to look back on this year. We said it I said it last week. I think we're going to look back at the end of the year. That Indiana result's going to be an outlier for a couple of different reasons, because of who Indiana is, because of the Nebraska team that showed up that Saturday in Bloomington, and just because of the point of the season where that was, relative to everything else. I think you're going to look back and be like, okay, well, for the most part, I liked everything Nebraska did this year, except for that one. And then when you have the full context of the season, you could zoom out and be like, oh, maybe I overreacted to that result in real time.
Yeah, it's interesting, as I think, I'm looking at this matchup for UCLA, fairly one-dimensional. We'll see what the bye week brings in terms of them being able to add something in the run game. But Nebraska's a mirror image isn't exactly right, but Coach Rule did describe how they like to play, right? The ball comes out quick. The running backs on the perimeter catching the ball are an extension of the run game. They haven't had a ton of success running it consistently. How much do you think familiarity helps Nebraska in this one, considering some of what UCLA does? I mean, they'll throw it 40-plus times now. Nebraska has a good idea of what it's supposed to look like.
Yeah, I think I think Nebraska's kind of expecting everything just because of they know and the way Matt Rule called it, and a couple people have called it at this point. Eric Bieniemy offense and a bye week, and he's going to be fired up because of his personal ties to this this matchup as well. Nebraska, I mean, UCLA is going to run plays and not necessarily an offense, and that's the biggest thing. Is Nebraska has to be ready because they're going to throw you the kitchen sink play to play. It may not string together, it may not sequence together, they may not put a whole lot of drives, but they still have the skill players that I think are athletic enough to make some home run plays happen. And so I think Nebraska's gonna have to be on their P's and Q's defensively this weekend, because again, and you also have to like factor in, this is an Ethan Garbers that's playing probably the most confidence he's ever had coming off what he did against Rutgers.
And despite the 9 picks too, he does come across as a guy that has really good command of where guys need to be in this passing game.
Yeah, like you watch him and you're like, that like I watch him and I'm like, this doesn't look like a guy that's thrown more picks and interceptions this year. Like
Mm.
for a variety of reasons, because of the offensive issues and a lot of different things. And he's not a perfect quarterback or like, even like a pro or anything by any means, but has a better command than you think when you just look at his stat line and you look at, the offensive struggles they have. I think that schedule also as well, they are better than their record indicates just because of the teams they've played this year.
Mm. Tim, speaking of Garbers and being a little bit better or a little bit different than the stat line indicates, his rushing numbers aren't going to jump off the page at you, but we've seen his ability to hurt people with his legs as well. What's your level of concern with Garbers hurting Nebraska on the ground?
Somewhat, but I mean, like if it gets to that point where how he's beating you, that's you take that. Like, I mean, they're not going to win a game off the Ethan Garber's run game, So if that's what it takes to get some positive plays going, I think as a staff and as a program, I think Nebraska takes that on Saturday.
TV, when you're looking at Nebraska offensively, I mean, we've heard kind of the murmuring the last handful of weeks, and screen game. You weren't here, but screen game is now the new two gap from the Bo Pelini era, where we talk about it as though we have good command of it. When you look at the execution versus intent, or the QB check with me's, what would you like to see different if Nebraska's going to stay the course?
I mean, like my thing is at this point, it's like with the screen game is we've seen them be creative with it. That Ramir Johnson screen, I think against Rutgers, where it's off of the the little reverse thing they run to Ja'Cory, where they fake the reverse and then throw it back flat. And I think they have to get back to that, like being a little creative. If you want to make the screen game go, you got to be a little creative with it and find some of those spark plays. And honestly, like me and Steve have kind of harped on this all week. We really think Nebraska found something in the run game last week with some of those traps and whams they ran. I think there's some sustainability there, and I think if you're able to get something consistently in the ground game, which we'll see, UCLA presents a big test. Jay Toa, that linebacker room, like they attack the run pretty well, even though they haven't faced it a whole lot. They attack it pretty well. And so if Nebraska is able to get something consistently going in the ground game, perhaps you see them pull back a little bit on those screens, because again, the whole point of screens is just to, kind of replicate the ground game as much as they can when they couldn't.
Yeah, Tim, Coach Rule mentioned how or really no one's been able to run the ball super successfully against UCLA.
Yeah.
How do you kind of pair that with your belief that they found something in the running game that can be a little bit more successful? Like, what does success look like on the ground against UCLA?
Better find a way to move the nose. That's for sure.
Yeah, like that's the big thing is just again finding ways to get things going, and I think for me success would just look like, hey, can we average 6 yards a pop? Can y'all do that on Saturday? That would be success, at least for me, on the ground. And yeah, I mean UCLA, I'll say this too, like I mean this, like that no one's been able to run on them consistently, but also they've also faced the like second least amount of rush attempts in the Big Ten. Like that's it's kind of a stat
that's a good distinction with their EP. I like that. That's a good deep pull. That's why I think there's only really a couple of games you can look at, and I think Indiana's one, but even Indiana's offense, like their run expectancy is so. One of the reasons Indiana's good is because they're unpredictable of when they're going to run the ball, right? So they're kind of an outlier, but that's why I think watching Penn State is critical, because they're the one team I think that made a concerted effort in multiple ways, because Kodanicki is a very good and creative OC. Penn State still struggled for the majority of that game to really run the football. TV.
Yeah. And yeah, and especially considering what that unit is, that's something that I it stuck with me too. Those numbers, and I'll say this with Indiana too. I think Indiana is a team that this year feels like they ride the hot hand. Like again, throw game's working, they'll throw it 6 times in a row. If Rourke's hot. But on the flip side, yeah, I think with Nebraska, like again, I'd want to see progress and I'd like to see progress, but I feel like you're going to have more rushing success overall against USC here in a couple of weeks than you will against UCLA.
Yeah, I mean, people look up and they'll see that they're top 15 in rush defense, and they'll be surprised. But part of it is I do love your context though, because I think that matters. But two things can be true at once. The sneaky part about them is they're really good up the middle. They've got a great nose. I love their Mike backer. Their safeties bring some drama too. Nebraska better take care of the ball as running backs kind of coming through the hole, because those safeties will get down into the box in a hurry.
Yeah, you can tell they specifically defensively, and again, it hasn't been the season they've wanted, but they really take on the personality of their head coach. Like they really embrace Deshaun Foster, specifically defensively. And I go back to something I think it was Matt Rule or Tony White said about how great nose play just makes your linebackers look better. And you just see how you look at the stat sheet and how active UCLA's linebackers are. You watch the film, you look at Jay Toe, like Jay's a guy, and I know people are like, oh, if he's at UCLA. It's a guy that entered the transfer portal, one from USC to go to UCLA, and then a second time this offseason and had offers from everywhere, but chose to come back and stick it out with UCLA, but could have gone anywhere. Like this is a guy that should be playing at Texas right now, or could be playing at USC or whatever right now. Like he could be in a couple of different spots.
Tim, as you look at, obviously the up the middle that they're really good, but we've heard about the secondary with UCLA. We talked to Matt Stevens, their color guy, earlier this week, maybe having some issues in the passing game. Do you think the best way for Nebraska to attack that is to try and kind of go off that play action pass game by establishing some of those run concepts you're talking about? Or you think it may have to work backwards in this game, considering the run defense seems to be their strength?
I think you work backwards in this game. I think this is a game where you get back to what Matt Rule wants to do, where you start the game, you try and put up some points early on offense, and then the second half, if you can get to it, in that second half, you kind of just sit on the ball and try and chew out clock and enforce the run and some short plays. But I think Dylan Raiola hinted at it this week, and I think like the confidence he gained last week with some of the downfield throws and seeing his receivers able to get open against Ohio State. I think Nebraska's going to try and threaten vertically a little bit this week to start the game, especially early. And I think it's going to be a point of emphasis. And then as the game goes on, you kind of get back to that ground game. And, again, if Nebraska is who they are, like I'd like to see Nebraska win a game Matt Rule wants them to win, which is leaning on Dante Dowdell to run for 75 plus yards in the fourth quarter.
So let me stay right there, TV. So offensively, because I'm with you. I do think Nebraska will take some shots outside the numbers, especially off of run action. But when you look at the kind of committee that Nebraska wants to use at the running back spot, what combinations would you go with that you like?
I really like. I've been a big Dante guy all year, but like seeing the stuff he has success with. And when it starts to click for him, it feels like he's a guy that needs some time to get into rhythm also needs like a lead blocker or a hole in front of him. I think like personally, like where I'm coming around on is I think Emmett needs to be your every down back. And then when you need a change of pace, or it's like, okay, we're going in I formation, or we know we're going to have this gap open. Let's bring Dante out there and see if we can get him into a rhythm and then ride the hot hand as long as he's hot. But he's a guy that I think at this point in his career, he's still young. He's a sophomore. Like, he's a guy that right now is a touch and go guy. When he's hot, he's hot. When he's not, it's just tough to get anything going. And so I think at this point, I think Emmett's got to be the guy. You mix in Ramir in there as a pass catcher and for some of the stuff he can do, in a phone booth. But I think it's got to be Emmett 1, mixing Dante a good bit in there, and then Ramir at that 3 spot.
Tim, did you feel like Dante Dowdell found anything last week? I thought he ran better against Ohio State than maybe we'd seen him run all year. It seemed like he got through a couple of those, like he was able to step through a couple of those initial tackles in a way we hadn't seen for a lot of the season. Like, You think that's an outlier or something he can kind of carry through the rest of the season?
It didn't feel like it felt more like anything, and it's like it's what we've seen from him in games previous too. When he's got a fullback in front of him, or when he's got a little bit of a runway, he can really go. And I think that's what he had because of some of the ways some of those blocks set up for him. Is he had a bit of a runway, coming out of the backfield on some of those runs, and once he got into that rhythm, which we saw that early in the year too. He gets 3-4 carries that go for 6+ yards, and all of a sudden that fourth carry is going for 19. And we'd seen that in early in the year, so it felt like it was getting back to that a little bit. And again, it's just more than anything, it's consistency of the staff being like, okay, run game's working, let's keep just like spamming that until we get something to break, and that's what they did. And I think he found something, just in the sense that I feel like he's getting his confidence back, because I remember saying this somewhere after, I think it was game 2 after that Colorado game. The way he was walking around after that Colorado game, the weeks after, he was moving around with some confidence. I started to see that body language again on Saturday against Ohio State. So I'm curious to see what pregame Dante we get, because you can tell when he's feeling it.
TV, let me get you out of here on this. When you look at kind of the evolution of their emergence in the conference, you got Southern Cal, UCLA, obviously with Washington and Oregon. When you look at kind of recruiting and its fertility, does UCLA have any staying power compared to the other three, or how would you rank the West Coast bias as they try to get integrated in the Big Ten?
It's tough for them right now. I mean, they have a couple things going for them, and I really think a strong end to their season, because of how tough the start of this year was for them, is kind of critical there. It's just tough to sell. Like I like, part of it is, I think what they have an opportunity to do now, and I wonder if they do that, with as this thing shifts, is, hey, we're the LA school that's building something right now, because right now, Lincoln Riley's kind of like the stale, old guy at this point, and so I think UCLA has that opportunity to kind of sell this, like, hey, we're young, we're a staff that's going to get a bit of some time here. We're going to get 2-3 years. You can still play in LA, and you have an opportunity to compete in the Big Ten. I'm not super worried about them, just because they haven't really shown an effort to be a real threat in any areas Nebraska's in right now. Like, they're not in the Midwest, they're not in Texas, they're not really in Florida, they're not really battling Nebraska. If Nebraska finds himself on the West Coast, you have to be a little wary of them. But right now, I'm not super threatened of them. And we'll see. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some staff changes there after year one, just because I think they need a little more recruiting juice to stick around and stay competitive with the rest of the Big Ten powers.
That's Tim Verghese from Inside Nebraska. Tim, we appreciate it as always. We'll talk to you again soon.
Yes, sir. See y'all tomorrow.